Okay, welcome to part 14, where we're still looking at where the Book of Mormon come from. And what we were going to do today is look at an overview of what we've kind of discussed thus far. And we've seen that it began with Solomon Spaulding, who lived from 1761 to 1816. You see, the description of him that we have made is he had some war experience in the Revolutionary War. We know he was educated at Dartmouth College. We know he had a law education for a little bit under Zephaniah Swift, which, interesting enough, if I remember right, Alma and Helaman, I think, talks about uh, things to do with courtroom and lawyers, if I remember correctly. And there's the classics education at Dartmouth. We know that he had a curiosity about the first inhabitants and the mounds he saw, and that probably gave him the idea of the first manuscript, right? And then, of course, we know he was also known to be a preacher. He went and studied theology, and we know he had biblical knowledge, and he could write in the old style, in the King James style, so to speak. And he was nicknamed "Oh Come to Pass," as I believe Abner Jackson called it. He had the ability to write, and certainly we see that. Yes, it wasn't very good. In fact, we know that the first story he wrote only for amusement, and he didn't finish the book. It has an abrupt ending, so that which shows us that it's not even fit for publication. In fact, we know that there are some missing pages, and we saw that. I think it was with Robert Harper that, remember, they were playing cards one night and they allowed one sheet from the novel that he would to be used, and which shows me that he was no longer working on that. So it was never finished, missing pages, abrupt ending, plus has a different storyline. It's about the Romans, when when the witnesses said no, it was about the lost 10 tribes of Israel and about them, of course, coming to America. So we know it's about that. And I think um, then what we see here is manuscript number two, which has a different title. Manuscript story, Conway Creek was the first manuscript's title, but then you have manuscript found, which was submitted to R&J Patterson in Pittsburgh, but we know he still needed to work on it some more, but it went missing somehow. And then you have, interesting enough, in the Cleveland Advertiser, February 15th, 1831. So it's interesting to me that Rigdon was, and we'll talk more about this later, but he was converted to the LDS Church in November of 1830. So just 2 months later, we see that someone has already made a connection between Rigdon and the Book of Mormon. And then August 7th, and I meant to put 1831, so I apologize for that. And that was several months later, and September 1st, 1831, there was Gordon Bennett, who somehow came across some information that there's a connection between the Book of Mormon and Rigdon. And I find that very interesting. And then in February 12th and 13th of 1832, we have Hyde and we have Samuel Smith, Orson Hyde, Samuel Smith, and it was Nehemiah King, who was there at that meeting in Conneaut, who said that Spaulding's writings were very similar to the Book of Mormon. And we have Orson Hyde's diary. We have also some other witnesses like the widow. We have some of the Conneaut witnesses that talk about this, like the undrafted letter of of Aaron Wright. And then, so that's 2 years, right, after the Book of Mormon was published. Then, in the summer and autumn of 1833, which we know that some of this was August 1833, we know some of this was September 1833, we finally get the witnesses from John and Martha Spaulding, R. Smith, Annie Hume Howard, Aaron Wright, Henry Lake, John Miller, and Artemus Cunningham. And Holbert had taken down their statements. And then you have a list of later from 1839 to, the 1900s almost. And then you have Matilda Davidson, who points out that Rigdon had stolen it. You have Joseph Miller, who pointed out that Rigdon had stolen it. You got Reddick McKee. Um, I meant to put there that he also points out that Rigdon was somehow in a part of it. Matilda McKinstry, Abner Jackson, Cephas Dodd, who George French second-hand testimony through Cephas Dodd, who said Rigdon had done it. Robert Harper, and of course that's second-hand testimony. Daniel Spencer, and then William Leffingwell. So I think it's very interesting to see all this come together. Now, we want to look at Rigdon. Is there a connection between Solomon Spaulding and Sidney Rigdon? Because we do want to go, we want to go by the principle that a person is presumed innocent until proven guilty. And the question is, was Rigdon in the right place? Was he at the right time to have stolen the manuscript? Did he have given the opportunity to do so? Now, let's hear what some have said. So this is Samuel Cooper. He was a veteran of 3 wars, and a letter to the present writer dated June 14th, 1879, stated in the printing office, stated as follows. I was acquainted with Mr. Lambden, was often in the printing office, was acquainted with Silas Ingalls, the foreman of the printing office. He never mentioned Sidney Rigdon's name to me, so I am satisfied he was never engaged there as a printer. I was introduced to Sidney Rigdon in 1843. He stated to me that he was a Mormon preacher or lecturer. I was acquainted with him during 1843 to 1845. Never knew him before. Never knew him as a printer. Never saw him in the bookstore or printing office. Your father's office was in the celebrated Molly Murphy's Row. And this was written to Robert Patterson Jr. So just to let y'all know about that. Isaac Craig, he says, Dear Sir, I received the history of Washington County some time ago, but had not, on account of the condition my eyes are in, read your account of the origin of the Book of Mormon. To comply with your request, I have read it to me last night, and I think you have made good use of the materials at hand, and I believe the spirit in which it is written is the proper one to command the attention of honest Mormons. Mrs. Eichbaum's statement to you is a surprise to me for 2 reasons, and we'll talk about Mrs. Eichbaum later. Because I called on her to learn if she could throw any light on the matter, and she could give me none. This was a year or 2 before the date you assigned for her statement. 2. The intimacy, she says, existed between Lambden and Rigdon. In all my investigation, I never found anyone who knew of this. All impressed me with the belief that it was Silas Ingalls with whom Rigdon was intimate. That Rigdon had a small tannery on Penn Street near hand for the manufacture of bookbinders, sheepskins, and supplying these to the office brought him in contact with Ingalls. This impression I obtained from John Sanderson, an old-time butcher, who sold sheep pelts to Rigdon. I'm sorry you used Reddick McKee's statement for the reason that he subsequently made another, which conflicts with that you use, and the Mormons can use it with considerable effect to show how unreliable he is. Samuel Cooper's statement that your father's office was in the celebrated Molly Murphy's Row, otherwise Clapboard Row, is new to me. I never heard of it being any other place than 4th Street. Cooper, whom you say was a veteran of 3 wars, never smelled powder. The nearest he ever came to it was at Black Rock, where they all showed the white feather. I knew him well and was fond of listening to his yarns, but when I grew older, I discovered that he was good at pulling the longbow. I agree with you that Parley P. Pratt was the man who brought Rigdon and Smith together. I think you might have used the statements of Isaac and Alva Hell in your closing remarks with good effect. I had some correspondence with Alva, and he sent me a book containing some matter relating to Joe Smith operations before and after he married Emma Hell. They're quite interesting. Alva moved to northern Illinois within 30 miles of Plano, where his sister Emma Smith lived and died, but he did not know until I told him where she lived. He wrote me that Emma never forgave him for testifying against Joe. I suppose Alva was now dead, as he was very old when he wrote to me. Did George Plummer Smith ever tell you of his interview with Emma Smith? It is very important, but he imparted it to me in confidence. Perhaps now that Emma is dead, he might feel relief from bond of silence for the public good. I think you should have mentioned that Holbert had been a Mormon. It's my impression that he and Mrs. Rigdon could tell all that is to be told in regards to the origin of the Mormon Bible. The silence of Mrs. Rigdon is very significant to me, but that old scamp Holbert is such a liar that anything he would say unless corroborated would have little weight. I was glad to learn that Reverend Aaron Feld enabled you to so satisfactorily clear up the charge against John Cannon. I had a friend at Harrisburg who was going to investigate that very point when he found friend Ehrenfeld was ahead of him. I am very much astonished at Albert's conduct in the matter. The positiveness of his statement induced me to believe he must have had good authority for his statement. His letter in the history of Washington County seems to me to be a very contemptible way of creeping out of the affair, for he really has no foundation for his charge. The article he mentions does not in any manner implicate John Cannon. I confess I was too hasty when I wrote that I would not be surprised if it was true. The fact is, nearly all the prominent old settlers in Washington County have some queer antics in their records, and I am never surprised at anything said of them. Your good father, old father, was one of the few of whom nothing out of the proper line can be said. If my eyes get better this winter, I'm going to make a point to find that matter regarding John Cannon for my own, as well as your satisfaction. Please excuse the appearance of this note, as I can hardly see. Very truly, Isaac Craig. If you have 2 or 3 more copies of your article, I would be glad to buy them for friends interested in this matter. So there's several things there, and unfortunately, I've not been able to locate the things he's talked about. So if anyone has any information on that, I'd be glad to hear it out. Then there's Robert Dubois. He says, Reverend Robert P. Dubois of New London, Pennsylvania, under date of January 9th, 1879, writes, I entered the bookstore of Robert Patterson in Lambden in March 1818, when about 12 years old, and remained there until the summer of 1820. The firm had under its control the bookstore on 4th Street, a bookbindery, a printing office, not newspaper, but job office under the name of Butler in Lambden, embraced on Diamond Alley, and a steam paper mill on the Allegheny, under the name of R&J Patterson. I knew nothing of Spalding, then dead, or of his book, or of Sidney Rigdon. So, really can't use anything of what he said. Isaac King, highly respected citizen of Library, Pennsylvania, and an old neighbor of Rigdon, states in a letter to the present writer dated June 14, 1879, that Sidney lived on the farm of his father until the death of the latter in May of 1810. For a number of years afterward, farming with very indifferent success. It was said he was too lazy and proud to make a good farmer. Received his education in a log schoolhouse in the vicinity. Began to talk in public on religion soon after his admission to the church, probably at his own instance, as there is no record of his licensure. Went to Sharon, Pennsylvania for a time, was there ordained as a preacher, but soon returned to his farm, which he sold June 26, 1823, to James Means, and about the time of the sale, removed to Pittsburgh. Then we have Carville Rigdon, and he writes Rigdon's relatives at Library, Pennsylvania, Carville Rigdon, his brother, and Peter Boyer, his brother-in-law, in a written statement dated June 27, 1843, certified to the facts and dates as above stated in regards to his birth, schooling, united with the church, licensure, ordination, and settlement in Pittsburgh in 1822. Mr. Boyer, also in a personal interview with the present writer in 1879, positively affirmed that Rigdon had never lived in Pittsburgh previous to 1822, adding that they were boys together and he ought to know. It's true he never lived in Pittsburgh, but did he visit frequently Pittsburgh? That's the question. Mr. Boyer had for a short time embraced Mormonism, but became convinced it was a delusion and returned to his membership in the Baptist Church. He was born on his father's farm, Piney Fork of Peters Creek, St. Clair Township, Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, February 19th, 1793, where he lived till the winter of 1818-1819, and followed farming and received a common English education. In the fall of 1817, he professed religion and joined the regular Baptist church of that place, and in the winter of 1818 and 1819, he went to Beaver County, Pennsylvania, where he studied divinity with a Baptist preacher by the name of Clark. And was licensed to preach by the Connoquenessing Church, time not recollected, and went from there to Warren, Ohio, and was ordained a regular Baptist preacher, returned to Pittsburgh in the winter of 1821 and 1822, took the care of the first regular Baptist church. There he continued to preach till the Baptist Association met in Pittsburgh. Precise time not recollected, but we think about the fall of 1824, at which time they brought some charges against him for not being sound in the faith, brought him to trial, but denied him the liberty of speaking in self-defense, and he declared a non-fellowship with them, and began to preach Campbellism. And he and they that joined with him got the liberty of the courthouse. There they held their meetings. He and his brother-in-law, Mr. Brooks, followed the tanning business till the winter of 1827 and 28, when Sidney Rigdon moved somewhere into the Western Reserve in Ohio, and there continued to preach till the Latter-day Saints came to that part of the country. And he joined them and continues to be an elder in that church of Latter-day Saints called Mormons. In confirmation of the above statements, we hereby subscribe our names, Carville Rigdon and Peter Boyer. And then we have one of the sons of Sidney Rigdon, and he says, About 1832, while my father was preaching at Mentor, Ohio, Martin Harris and Oliver Cowdery called upon him and presented. Now, it wasn't Martin Harris, it was actually Parley Pratt and two others. Um, it presented to him the Book of Mormon and told him it was found by Joseph Smith engraved on gold plates, and that Smith translated the engravings, and the book was a true translation. That they had seen the plates, that Harris had written the translation given by Joseph Smith. They asked him to read it, give them his opinion of it. He gave them permission to preach in his church, went to hear them. At the close, he told the congregation that they had listened to some strange doctrine, but it was their duty to investigate. Cowdery and Harris left next morning, but returned in about 6 weeks. They asked, and that's wrong too, I believe. They asked my father if he had read the book and said he had. They asked what he thought of it. He asked if Joseph Smith was a man of intelligence. Cowdery said Smith had about as much knowledge as he had. Father replied if that was the case, Smith was not the author of the book. Sometime after this, father met Joseph Smith for the first time in the state of New York. After being in Smith's company for some time, he joined the Mormon church, removed to Kirtland, and began preaching Mormonism. He afterward went to Missouri, thence to Nauvoo, Illinois, and after Smith's death, my father claimed it was his right to lead the church. But Brigham Young was chosen. In 1847, father removed to Friendship, New York, where he remained until his death, July 14, 1876, aged 84. He retired to private life after removing to Friendship, New York. Would occasionally lecture. Large crowds always came out when it was announced he would speak. By his calm and dignified demeanor, he gained the respect of all. In answer to the statement of Clark Braden in Saints Herald under Christianity versus Mormonism, I have only to quote Horatio Seymour, who pronounced Rigdon as a very eloquent man. Martin Grover, one of New York's greatest jurists, who said Sidney Rigdon's knowledge of the history of the world and the political history of our country was perfectly surprising to him, and that he was a very learned and eloquent man. Professor Hatch frequently said Rigdon was the best historian he ever saw, one of the most eloquent men he ever listened to. Also, Reverend Braden's statements about Rigdon's extravagant yarns, highfalutin rant, his visions, the power while speaking and falling in trances in the pulpit have no truth in them whatever. Sidney Rigdon was a devout Christian from his youth to his grave. He preached and taught the Bible on all occasions when necessary to his children and all. He died having a firm belief in the Christian religion. I never knew one who was a stronger believer in the Christian religion than he. I therefore renounce such assertions as positively untrue. I am probably better acquainted with Sidney Rigdon than any living person. Had better opportunities through business and family relations to know the character, history, and religious belief than anyone else. Religion was his favorite theme. On returning from Salt Lake City in 1865, where I had interviews with the leading dignitaries of the Mormon Church at that place on the subject of Mormonism and the Book of Mormon, I asked my father to tell me the facts as to the production of this book. My father said that all he knew of the origin of the book was what Harris, Cowdery, and Joseph Smith told him. That Smith, during the 15 years he was intimate with him, never stated anything else than that he found engraven on gold plates which he found in a hill in New York. He said after investigation he was confident that the story about Spalding writing the Book of Mormon was untrue. He said the same story about his writing the book was false. That he never saw the book until it was presented to him by Oliver Cowdery at Mentor, Ohio. Knowing my father as I do, I am confident he told me the truth. My father never saw Solomon Spalding in his life, nor did he steal any of his manuscripts, as stated by Reverend Braden. My mother survived my father about 10 years. After father's death, in conversation with her about the Book of Mormon, she always told me that my father obtained it from Cowdery and Harris at Mentor, Ohio, and that the stories about father having written it were untrue. Father and mother told me the same story in my youth and manhood, and they told me in their old age, and they never told any other. I am not a member of any religious denomination. Do not pretend to say how that book came into existence, but I am as certain as that I exist that Sidney Rigdon never wrote any part of the Book of Mormon, and they never saw it until Harris and Cowdery presented it to him at Mentor, Ohio. Of course, it wasn't Mentor. It was actually, I believe, Kirtland, Ohio, and there's some other thing. And once again, it wasn't Martin Harris. Then there was a daughter named Nancy Rigdon. So she says, learning that a daughter of Rigdon was living in Pittsburgh, a reporter called on her yesterday, and at first she declined to say anything at all on the subject. But finally, on the scribe, promising not to use her name, she is married, she said, I have never had the honor of seeing this so-called Reverend Covert, who of late has been so free in his use of dead men's names, but I understand he parts his hair in the middle of his head, a fact which, from what I have heard and read of him, is no surprise to me. Now, while I most emphatically decline to be drawn into any controversy over the story, that story of Covert, which, if there was any foundation for it, I cannot for the life of me see why it is allowed to remain quiet for years after all the actors are laid in their graves. Yet I will say this, that my father, who had the respect of all who knew him, and at that time when he had but little hope of living from one day to another, said to the clergymen around him, of which there was a number belonging to various denominations, these were his words: As I expect to die and meet my Maker, I know nothing about where the manuscript of the Book of Mormon came from. The lady said further that she believed as firmly as she believed anything that Joseph Smith, who was, she believed, at one time a good man, had a revelation, that the Mormon Bible was founded on that revelation. But she was satisfied the Reverend Covert had never seen a copy of it and consequently did not know what he was talking and writing about. And so that's what Nancy Rigdon said about that. So what I want to do next is we're going to stop there. And next, we're going to show you a biography of Rigdon. And I'm going to have sources down there. I really appreciate you being with us. Thank you very much.